If you need to get a bite to eat, you might want to turn your video off, and that is fine because it is being recorded. So just be aware of that. And then we're really optimizing this for deciding and acting. So a lot of this work is going to be accomplished offline as opposed to in the meeting. We expect a lot of preparation being done outside of this group. And with that, I want to just real quick turn this over to Amy for a quick comment.
So there were some questions after the last meeting that we had about why we're talking about staff. And I thought it would be good to give you a little bit of like background information. When we sent out the survey, we received some results that said answering service. And we have also kind of struggled with some contractors saying, you know, I have an answering service that's sufficient for staff. So I really wanted you to kind of have that context. We're not just looking for things to try and, you know, identify this is an issue. So hopefully if you've been wondering why we're talking about staff now, you have, oh, you understand. So that was it.
Very good. Thank you, Amy. So we'll start this off with the round robin, really just to get about 5 minutes is what we're going to hold the time to. You'll see a little timer there that we have on the table. And we have a limited amount of time. We have until 1 o'clock. So 12 of you speaking for 5 minutes each will be an hour. And so we want to really make the most of that time. So this particular 5 minutes is for any thoughts about the collected data, as well as any vulnerabilities and risks to entities and or our agency with any of these particular, the 3 items that we're looking at. Autumn, you have a question?
I do. I'm just curious with this format, it feels obviously scripted because that's what you're planning for, but I just find that when we're having these conversations that someone else will bring up a point that I'll be like, oh, yeah, actually, that now reminds me of this and this and this. And I just feel like that's extremely common in these kinds of meetings. And so I'm just wondering if you're accounting for that in some way, whether, you know, if someone only goes 2 minutes, then like at the end, they can be like, oh, well, this person said this. So now I've thought of all these other things that, you know, I just think if we're doing this work as in our own little silos, doing the homework, we're not actually communicating with each other about you know, bouncing ideas off of each other. So I'm just wondering how we deal with that issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you're right. If we do have some time left over prior to, so this would end at 12:50 if everybody used their full 5 minutes. And if we had a little extra time and we had additional comments, we can certainly open it up for that. In addition, the drafting of the definition and then the ratios, using the Robert's Rules of Orders just to kind of, you know, keep that organized. There will be an opportunity for discussion there as well. Back comment on something somebody else said, and also in the subsequent round robin next week too, because there will certainly be times where maybe you don't have a whole lot to comment on the current topic that we're facing, but maybe you want to flesh out a previous topic a little more based on previous comments. Does that make sense? All right. And a lot of it is it's just time constraints, trying to make the most of all of our time here, right? And then we'll talk about the timeline at the end too. So if this is something that needs to be extended, because we do have a lot of discussion that needs to happen in order for this to be a valuable process, then we can certainly talk about adding additional meetings too. So far, we're running ahead, but again, we haven't really dug into it yet. So what I'd like to do is start off, and I'll invite the first person, and then when you're done, please invite the next person. And Autumn, I should have sent you an email that I was going to invite you first, but I really did have you listed as the person I want to invite first to have your 5 minutes to start that off.
Okay, well, I might reserve some time then.
You bet.
Okay, so yeah, I read through the OPDS descriptions of their legal secretary, and I guess my initial thoughts were that we just don't use the term legal secretary in my office, or I think in other PD's offices here in Multnomah County. I collected the general sort of support staff descriptions of jobs from both my office at MDI and the MPD office from Carl. So I have those. I can like condense them down into a document that could be shareable. I just frankly was in court all the way until 11:30, so I had not done it this morning, and I got some of the documents from Carl this morning. So anyway, point being, I thought that both of the titles that were indicated in OPDS were far more than any of the support staff does at either of the public defense offices, both from my just personal perspective of seeing what they do, and also from the actual job descriptions that we have written up as a part of our union. So that was my initial thought. Like, they talked about typing and proofreading and correcting draft documents, submitting drafts for review by legal professionals. All of that was stuff that is not done by any sort of support staff in our office. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know which direction we're going to go, whether we're trying to change what our staff do or define what, sorry, there's a man washing a window right next to me, so it's a little distracting. So I don't know whether we're trying to define what we currently do and make that an accurate representation in the contract language, or whether we're trying to adopt standards that are already used in various offices, OPDS being one, MDI and MPD being the other ones that I'm familiar with, and use those as then a model for other offices. So I guess, I don't know if you want to answer that, or whether that's just going to be a discussion point.
No, that's a great point, Autumn. I can clarify that real quick. We are trying to adopt a standard, not for OPDS. We're trying to adopt a standard for a contract with each of the entities that we currently contract with. And so it would be a PD's office, a consortium, and or a law firm.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my initial feedback is just that the kind of sample ones that were used from OPDS, I do not think reflect in any way what is utilized in the offices that I've done research on. And frankly, we don't really have paralegals at all. So that's just not been an issue in either of the offices. I did collect, I'll just tell you the titles of our jobs at MDI. We have receptionist, which is literally just answering the phones and like kind of being at the front. And then office assistant, which is basically just administrative tasks. 45% of their stuff is legal support, but 40% is like inventory, troubleshooting, printers, whatever. And then we also have legal assistant, which sometimes we also interchange with trial assistant. And they're what everyone I think would think is their primary assistant that's helping with cases. And that one, those people do not create documents or review our motions or do anything that could be considered like really in the legal realm. And I'm gathering the same thing from Metro as well. Metro has legal assistant 2. They have an office assistant, which is similar to our administrative assistant. And they actually do have a title of legal secretary. And the legal secretary has a specific job that's related to typing and formatting and proofreading various reports and things. I haven't talked to anybody there to know how many of those they have, whether that's as prevalent as the trial assistants, but they have someone in particular that does that. And then they also have a data integrity specialist and a data integrity assistant. So they have a manager and a lower one there. So this one is basically tracking cases, managing their case data system, because they have a much bigger system. So I guess I'll leave it there for now. That's kind of just like what I saw out there. And I can help to provide some of this language to incorporate in too. And if while other people are talking, I can do that in the background and that's helpful, I'll do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great.
It to someone
Please
else.
send that to us.
Okay, I can. Olcott, I'll kick to you.
We can't hear you yet, Olcott. Nothing yet.
I think he's leaving and coming back in.
You might be trying to leave and come back in.
Oh, he's paused, yeah. So can we go?
Autumn, do you want to invite someone else until
Sure.
Olcott comes in?
I see Rebecca's up in the corner of my screen, so I will pick her.
All right, thank you.
Hey folks, so I reviewed this stuff and looked at it. I'm gonna admit Olcott. I don't know why I have that option, but I feel like I should do that. I reviewed this stuff, and what I can tell you is that OPDS's requirement that people have some kind of staff is new for a lot of the people, at least on our contract. And so I think that most of them just refer to their staff as a legal assistant, which kind of encompasses a lot of different things. Within my firm, long before we had this requirement, I have a paralegal, a receptionist, and a legal assistant, and they each have different job duties. But I think all the rest of the people on our contract just have what they would call a legal assistant. I think you pay a lot more with paralegals, particularly if they have a degree, but they can do a lot more. So for example, our paralegal does do some legal research for us sometimes. Our paralegal does prepare legal documents for my review, and the other lawyers in the firm who are doing juvenile work for their review. And so our paralegal does do things like that. And I'm going back to the document to look at the document. But paralegals can be incredibly helpful, but also can be more expensive if you're specifically talking about a paralegal. I don't know anybody who uses the term legal secretary. I would agree with what was said, but it sounds like actually some people still do. But we don't. We mostly just use legal assistant, and the legal assistant is doing mostly what they're doing is calendaring. They are answering the phone sometimes in some firms. In some firms they're not. They're maintaining calendars. They are filing documents. Everything has to be e-filed, so they're filing documents. They now that we are doing everything via COVID, most of the legal assistants are sending stuff out for like admissions and things like that via DocuSign. And so they're managing things like that to make sure our clients can get documents and DocuSign. None of the people in our group have clients that or have assistants that go to the jail. I know that in some contracts they do that though. Sometimes they go to the jail because you're supposed to have that, initial meeting. In our county, it's always the lawyer that goes to the jail, but at least for the Bruce can speak up for what they do on the criminal piece. We do just juvenile stuff. And so, I'm looking at some of the stuff where they're talking about coordinating and taking testimony transcription. No, I don't know anybody that does that. And maintaining the case management system, yes, they do that. Emails, reminding of dates, all those types of things. And we actually had in our county recently a training with my staff and all of these new people who were hired to make sure that we are in compliance with OPDS's contract, because so many of the attorneys in my group said, okay, I've hired staff. OPDS wants me to have staff. Now what do I do with them? And so I was like, oh man, staff is wonderful. Staff is amazing, here's all the wonderful things staff can do. And they're really starting to embrace it now. So, oh, the other thing that staff will occasionally do in the juvenile contract is if the lawyer has a conflict, staff might attend a CRB, a Citizens Review Board. So staff does that sometimes too. And I'll let Bruce talk about what the criminal piece does in Clackamas County.
Thank you, Rebecca. Bruce, are you there?
He's there.
Can you hear me okay?
There we go. Yep. Go for it.
I've got a, I'll email it to everybody, but, you know, a lot of our folks are new to having legal assistance. So it's the paralegal portions in this are probably not something that our attorneys would typically use, but most of the case organization skills, conflict checks, just keeping clients on track are the things that people are using their assistance for now. And primarily processing discovery is the big thing. I've drafted up a description here. I'll send to everybody. I was looking at the staffing numbers in these proposals, and they're sort of all over the board. You know, when I started out, I had my own legal assistant 20 years ago that I didn't share with anybody. I don't think that's necessary anymore, just because of case management software and just the nature of the practice. Out here, I think we're at about 14 or 15 legal assistants to 29 attorneys. And that seems about right. I think once these newer legal assistants get trained up, they could probably support 3 attorneys effectively. Then again, we're sort of disparate in different locations, so that's a difficult task. But I think there's certain portions of things that we can take out of the legal assistant realm by adding, well, the legal secretary would be probably the appropriate description, or reception. And obviously it's difficult to have reception in a consortia because we may have, you know, anywhere from 15 to 20 different locations of people, plus separate lines for everybody. But reception would be pretty useful. And I know part of my legal assistant's day, I have 2 legal assistants, a good portion of their day is just fielding calls. And they're not able to, our phone rings so much, they're not able to do their regular legal assistant tasks effectively unless there's a full-time reception. So I've split it between 2. So I've sent my notice. The only thing I would add in there that I forgot is, and that's the case organization is entering all the contacts in each case. That's pretty significant. I mean, I was looking at reports yesterday, and it was a pretty basic theft to ID theft case, but it generated 100 pages of reports and probably 30 to 40 different entries of contacts just to check for conflicts. I'm guessing that's normal in many places, but you know, there's a significant amount of data entry in the legal assistant field. I can only see initials here, so I'm not sure who to pass off to. ML is the first on my screen.
Thanks,
I think
Bruce.
that's me, Mark Lang.
Yeah, we can hear you, Mark.
Can't hear me?
We can.
Okay. I would kind of, I mean, it's a little different for being on the, you know, in Columbia County, is that we're all kind of divided in terms of, each lawyer has their kind of their own separate office, and so it's not set up so that you can, like these job descriptions are set up or the staffing ratios are set up. So it can be a little tricky to try to find someone, especially if like your contract is like a portion of an FTE or something to that effect, to have staff that you can fit in that role adequately. And it's, if you have like less than a half-time contract, it's a little funky to try to have to schedule or find someone, a staff member that's going to fill that small type of role individually. So, and just because of conflict situations, it's not going to be easy to kind of share those people with the different lawyers in the different offices. So that could be I think a big issue. I think, especially in a smaller office, it's kind of, it's, other duties it's assigned as well that you're going to have in terms of whatever it's going to be. It's, processing mail, going to pick up something, trying to figure out, get clothes for the client that it's in custody or something to that effect. So I think it's really hard to kind of just define like, hey, this is your job that you're going to do only data entry. This is not really workable in a smaller office. And I think really kind of some of the risks I saw in some of the job descriptions is making sure that the attorney has adequate oversight of some of the staff, so that if at least that was popping in my mind with the paralegal, that you kind of have to be careful that they're not practicing law or doing things that you're not really able to keep track of. And then I think the other thing that's I think would be really helpful in terms of this staffing process is to figure out trainings for staff, because it's basically, and I'm not always, my personal self, I'm not always the best delegator. And so I think that would be a component of, going forward, is that we want to make sure that there is the ability to have some type of training component that we can send staff to, so that they can kind of get information on and maybe figure out how to do some of these work, or that way they can also make contact with other staff members and kind of build up a network with that as well. And so I think that could be helpful. But, that's kind of where I saw part of the things is basically, I use the term legal assistant. Does. I have staff that will go to the jail to meet with clients sometimes, or at least my staff does, and she'll attend CRB meetings if I can't get there on those, or kind of like these other meetings that can happen from time to time with DHS or other entities. So that's kind of what we kind of do with our end here. So, and I guess I can go to the next person on my list here is Tracy Gregg.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay. Know me, but I'm standing in for Todd McCann, and we're both members of Marion County's Juvenile Advocacy Consortium. So in our county, we have the contract to handle all the juvenile matters, dependency and delinquency. We have 18 separate lawyers, so they each have their own staff and own office. And because we do the dependency as well as delinquency matters, I think for conflict reasons, it really requires us to have our own staff and our own office. For those of you that do juvenile work, that we can have up to 3, sometimes 4, 5 consortial lawyers on one case. So it just would not be possible to share staff. So I think that's something that's very different from the criminal realm. So I think that's important for to be considered in looking at this. I'm not sure how it would be possible to share staff. So as we all have our own offices and our own staff, I mean, I'm sure some of you are individual practitioners and not part of a PD's office. The staff duties can be very, I mean, it can be anything in any given day. You know, we've heard about going to the jail. We've heard about getting clothes for a client. Obviously, it's some of the basics like answering phones, in non-COVID times, reception and having people in the office. Again, in non-COVID times, in our county, you know, I mean, we're trial lawyers, so we're in court and expected to be available for our juvenile cases Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. So anytime in the office in non-COVID times is before 8, after 5, weekends, holidays, all of those things. So I think in terms of our group, our kind of summary that we put together, by and large, everybody is a legal assistant person. And I think because that allows for a you know, a wide variety of job responsibilities under it. I agree with the others that I think legal secretary is kind of sexist and patriarchal and outdated. Let's see, specifically, I mean, obviously in non-COVID times, our assistants, you know, they are the one person in the office when we're not. So they are managing the physical duties of the office, you know, handling people that come into the office, handling all of the case management entries, answering phone, taking messages, handling the mail, conflict checks, you know, on criminal cases and juvenile cases, as Mark indicated, those can be very comprehensive and time consuming alone. I mean, retrieving and processing discovery, especially in these juvenile cases, sometimes we'll get thousands of pages of discovery in, and sometimes at the last minute. So, you know, our assistants sometimes are couriers, dropping things off, taking things to the attorney at court, so that we can give a copy of different things to our client. Obviously scheduling, you know, scheduling with court staff and other attorneys, coordinating with vendors, reporting time and tasks.
Cool.
You know, I think a lot of this stuff is the same. Each of us have our own office, so we all have our own case management system. So it would be very hard to kind of do a training that would be universal for all of us, because, you know, one person might have PC law, one person might have time matters, and somebody else might have LEAP, or, you know, go on and on and on from there. So it'd be really hard to coordinate and standardize kind of staff duties and training, I think, for individual offices and consortium members. That's about all I had. Looks like I've used most of my time.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Who do you invite?
We have a consortium here. I've also worked in Baker County consortia, took conflicts in Harney County, Malheur County. And so all of those counties have solo practitioners basically in their own firms. And so there's usually about a 1 to 2 staff to attorney ratio. My office has 1 staff. I also use Ruby Reception to take a little bit of the load off of my paralegal. I do call her a paralegal. But most people do use the term legal secretary, and I would agree that in the consortia, in these solo law firms, the role is quite broad. You know, everything from phones to motions to continue to client communication and making sure people are aware of court, reminding of meeting, calendaring. It's a very, very broad role. My paralegal also assist, as most of ours do, in trial at times, making pretrial interview appointments, ensuring witnesses know when to appear at court, helping put together trial binders, that sort of thing. So it really is a very broad role. And one of the notes that I made in reviewing the information is that it's a very, first of all, I also don't like the term legal secretary, but legal assistant and paralegal, I think it's a really blurry line in the solo firm context. It's a very broad role, and to try to parse it out into different things, I think would be really problematic for those solo firms. And so a couple other things that I noted as I was reviewing, it did say on page 6, I made a note about staff to attorney ratios, and a defender who has cases in multiple rural counties that involve substantial travel will need more staff to assist with work. And I think that's important to note. If I have a case and I have a jurisdiction trial in Baker County next week, it's 45 minutes away. I'll drive 45 minutes there in the morning and 45 minutes back in the afternoon, and that takes up parts of my day. County that's less than 45 minutes away from any other county. And so that's an important aspect, I think, especially out here in Eastern Oregon. And so I don't think we can set the same kind of ratios and definitions for PD firms and consortia. I just don't know that that will work. I also think that it potentially would have been helpful, and I don't know if others agree, to have I think in our request for proposals, that attachment 2 where we all kind of submitted our FTE for staff, I think that would be really helpful to review as we try to formulate appropriate ratios, just seeing what everyone else is doing right now. And so I think if that information could be distributed, that could be really helpful as we move forward in this process. I think a lot of people covered some of the things that I wanted to say. The only other thing that I noted was that, there was this whole section in the report about supervisors. Obviously, in these consortia contexts, there's no supervisor role. And so that, was really kind of inapplicable to the consortia context. There are a couple of firms that I can think of, Strawberry Mountain Law, for example, where they have Katie Dunn, and she would be the supervisor for the other attorneys. And I think Gary Cayuno over in Malheur has a similar setup in his office where they have, associate attorneys. But the vast majority out here are just solos, one practitioner firms. And same with, we can't share staff. That would just be unworkable, both in the dependency context, especially, but also because we get a lot of cases with co-defendants in the criminal side of things, so that, you really can't share. And so you have to maintain that appropriate separation. I did want to note that there's, out here, there's really only like one investigator per county. So I was just noting that as I reviewed the definition for investigator. We all share our investigator basically, because there is only one in our entire county. Others might have maybe 2, maybe 3, but that's just something that occurred to me as I reviewed the information. And I've used up my time, so I will invite Brooke to go next.
Thanks, Michelle.
Cool. Thanks, Michelle. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you, Brooke. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. I would agree with Michelle that it would be really helpful to sort of have as a basis what we had proposed in our RFPs. And I think some of the residual frustration I have on the whole RFP process with OPDS is it seemed like over years we've taken a bunch of time to try to do a lot of things. And then the RFP is always an afterthought because the agency says, well, here's your contract. And I know that is what it is, and it's not necessarily the way the agency wanted to set it up. So I'm not saying that to blame staff. I'm saying that because I think there are RFPs that we may want to look at as we go, particularly what the responses to the RFPs were and less to the boilerplate that was in there to start with. I did look at the ratios of different contracting entities, and I think NAPD probably provides the most useful guide of ratios and is the one that I would feel most comfortable with, given how I'm used to staff ratios being set up at my office. So I think the investigator for NAPD of like 1 to 3 is fantastic. I mean, I realize that'd be 1 to 4 would be great and would really help, I think, particularly when it's taking time to cut down on excessive caseloads in the meantime. For paralegals and administrative assistants, my law firm does use the title secretary, and it's at times have certainly winced at that, so I hope I'm not outing myself as patriarchal in that. That's certainly not my intention. We just have never changed the category because at our office, we actually have legal assistants, which are much more like a paralegal might be in a different office. Our legal assistants are the people who would traditionally go to the jail and see clients, and our secretaries are the people who will help with a letter, turn the attorney's scribble into a finished product, etc. So there is definitely bleed over between job titles, and I think it would be confusing if I focused too much on what my office did. So I think generally NAPD's goal of for every 4 attorneys, you have both 1 paralegal and 1 administrative assistant, I think makes a ton of sense. I think that gets you much closer to where you want to be for ideal ratios. I think supervisors 10 to 1 is also really important. I agree there's probably a different standard or a different expectation for consortia versus attorneys. Sorry, excuse me. I didn't get much sleep. Consortia versus public defender offices, where there's a traditional supervisor for these people. I think that we are better off having supervisors with both of those models, but I'm not quite sure how it would go into effect. I know OPDS has talked in the past about, well, OPDS would provide external case managers or external supervisors, and I don't know about that, but it does seem like having some sort of structure would make sense. I know at some of the bigger consortia that they have something akin to a supervisor, but I'll let actual consortia speak to what they have as to how that works. I know at my office, 10 to 1 is just about right for attorney to supervisor ratio. And then that also lets you decide if you go lower than 10 to 1, then maybe your supervisor will also have a caseload themselves. But 1 to 10, where the idea is the supervisor doesn't have a caseload, would be very effective if it could be paid for. There are a few parts that I didn't see addressed that I wanted to address. One is that I think for administration, you need someone, whether you call that person office manager or human resources, at least 1 to every 20 employees, and maybe lower. In my office, we have both a business manager who does HR and billing and that sort of stuff, and we have an office manager who orders supplies and handles the administrative work of counting cases and reporting to OPDS and some back-end tech support. I also think Billy had mentioned something about once you get to offices or 50 people or bigger, or maybe like 90 people or bigger, to have tech support. I actually think it's a better idea to try to build in tech support. I'm not sure if you call the ratio 1 to 30 or 1 to 40, but my guess is that most firms, even smaller firms like 15 or 20 person firms, are paying for a contractor to do a certain amount of tech support, and that needs to be reflected in the work that we do. Like my office, we had an on-site tech person and it didn't work, and we have a contractor who probably bills us easily 100 grand plus a year. So like we really do have a full-time worth of tech for the work that we do, and I think it's important to try to encompass that into the workload and figure that out. I guess the only other categories I'm curious about is I think figuring out reception is important, and whether it's 1 receptionist per X number, or whether you call that person a file clerk, I don't think it really matters, but some way once you get beyond a certain size of being able to budget for that. And then it would be very helpful if the agency had a bit more guidance on when and whether you redact files for clients and how that goes about. When I got to my office, we traditionally had this method of always redacting the material for the clients unless the attorney specifically said no. And I think that's a really good best practice, but it's never really been something that we've been compensated for. And I'm curious what other people think and whether it would be best if that did happen. The other way to do it is to absorb it through the NRE process and ask OPDS to pay for it, but that seems kind of clunky. And I can't imagine that it's better to load OPDS with more NREs into the future.
All right.
So
Thank
yeah.
you, Brooke. You're at 6 minutes, so we want to
All
honor
right.
other.
I did not mean to go more than 5. I didn't see the clock.
All right.
It's still too late.
Thank you. And who do you invite next?
I would invite Jonathan.
Thank you.
Well, okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Jonathan. Thank you.
That was one of the things that Brooke just took up, and you know, I can always do 4 if we need to. Okay, I don't want to take up anybody else's time, but a lot of what my assistants do and have done, especially in the last few years, is redacting discovery, preparing discovery for clients, preparing discovery for investigators, preparing discovery for doctors, you know, and all, you know, polygraphers and that kind of thing. And that does take up quite a bit of a legal assistant's time. Also, the case management. In my office, my assistant also is in charge of getting the numbers over to OPDS every month, as well as, you know, oftentimes in Multnomah County, at least, we get a frantic call from Ninja Defense and says, so-and-so is getting indicted or arraigned on a murder charge. We need somebody to take the case. And so we have to figure out who isn't completely filled up with murders, because we've just been having a lot of them lately. I mean, this is kind of a recent development, but that's one of the things that does take a significant amount of our assistants' time, especially in the mornings when we tend to get those calls. I do, however, think that probably about a 2 to 1 ratio of staff, 1 staff per 2 attorneys, seems like it works out pretty well. That's what we did at MDI when I was there, and that's what we did at other places that I've worked. And it seems like that's a pretty appropriate ratio. I mean, obviously, you know, 1 to 1 would be the best, but I also think there's a lot of variance, especially in the consortium model with the small offices. We have 6 small offices in our consortium in Portland, and I think there is a lot of variance in what the attorney needs the assistant to do or wants to do, and I saw that when I was at MDI too. Some attorneys really, you know, didn't maybe utilize their legal assist as much as possible. It's like, it depends on how much hands-off you want to be or hands-on you want to be. Some people needed more, you know, they needed more support. So, and I think a lot of that, it would have to be, you know, somewhat tailored to the individual attorney and their staff, and, you know, how everybody's going to get along and what they're going to do. I mean, even at MDI, where we had kind of a lead legal assistant or trial assistant who was in charge of training the new trial assistants. So there was more of a, you know, this is what you do as the trial assistant versus what maybe the attorney does or an investigator does, or the admin staff does. But even so, in that kind of, even in that office, I found that, you know, some people had their assistant do more than other people. So I just think there's and I agree with some of the things that some other people said about a staff training conducted by, say, OPDS probably wouldn't be necessarily the most helpful thing, based on, you know, like what other people said, you know, what software you use or how do you do your case management. But perhaps, you know, maybe some kind of best practices, you know, presentation on occasions could be helpful, and you know, get all of our folks to come to that. But I you know, making it mandatory, probably, I think you need to leave some flexibility for each individual you know, law firm and the individual model, because I'm sure there's a lot of variation in the way, you know, based on what I've heard, you know, consortia in Eastern Oregon, you need more staff than maybe consortia down in Western Oregon and in the Valley. So I don't think I have anything else. How about Olcott, if you're not muted anymore?
All right. Thank you, Jonathan.
Hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you, Alcott.
Yeah, my computer and Teams don't work well.
Well, we could hear you. Perhaps you're on mute again. No. There we go. Oh, no. I see your mute button going off and on your square, but I'm not hearing you at any time. Maybe try calling in. If you look at the, there's a phone number that you can call and put in a code. So Jonathan, who else would you, it looks like we have Jack Morris, John Hamilton, Chris Kino haven't spoken yet.
We'll go with Jack.
Hi, everybody. I don't have a lot to say. I don't want to spend a bunch of time repeating what some folks have said. I just want to make a couple of points. The first is, I think it's real important that we keep the maximum flexibility that we have and we not limit ourselves with definitions and that kind of thing, because everybody is so different. And it's so size and location dependent how our offices are set up. And that's especially true in my case because I manage my firm, which is the primary contractor in the Gorge, and also manage the conflicts consortium. I don't think the titles are particularly useful, whether it's a legal assistant or a paralegal. I think in small firms, you go to person's strengths and you use them that way, and they do what needs to be done, and that's about it. When I say I think it's important to keep the maximum flexibility, I want to sort of counter that with the statement that I really appreciated OPDS imposing a requirement for staff. My consortium folks, bless their hearts, since they're all sole practitioners, didn't really have staff with the exceptions of a couple of them, in spite of my attempts to get them to do that. And now they all do. And I think they're starting to appreciate that. And they certainly appreciate the money to be able to do that. So, and that kind of fits into the last comment that I'll make, and that's what the appropriate ratio is. Again, I think that should be flexible, but I agree with one of the last speakers that a 2-to-1 ratio seems to work. I mean, that works out when you have a sole practitioner to having a half-time person. A lot of practitioners are not going to have enough to do for a full-time person. That's just the truth of it. Once they have a staff for a long time who they work well with, that might change. But the ratio in my firm is higher than that. That works well for us. But, if you haven't heard anything else I say, just keep it as flexible as possible. If we start having to fit people and, square people into round holes or round people into square holes, it's really going to be difficult. It's difficult enough staffing the offices and certainly difficult staffing with attorneys as well. So that's what I got. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. You want to, it looks like we have John Hamilton, Alcott, and Chris Kino. Who do you want to invite?
Oh, let's go with Chris. He's always got something to say that's entertaining.
Well, I just got back. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you, Chris. Thank you.
Okay. Well, most entertaining part would be I just got back from sturgeon fishing. That was why I was a little late on the phone here, but I have listened to most of this and I just wasn't sharp enough to hook up on the computer at my house, unfortunately. But I would agree with some of the stuff that Jack talked about briefly there. I mean, as I've listened here, I've heard administrative assistant, legal secretary, paralegal, receptionist. I really think we ought to just I think we're really making it way too complicated. It should simply be employee/staff. That's what you got. And counties, and we need to realize that there's a big difference between large counties and small counties, both in hiring lawyers, which is very difficult in Clatsop County to find qualified good lawyers out here, as far as maybe as opposed to the Valley, the Tri-County area. We just have a difficult time out here finding folks. And so it's whether you're going to define people and how you're going to define them, I would just say call them employees, staff members, and leave it at that. I find, frankly, that we're a small consortium. We're 6 people. My office, we got 3 attorneys, and then we have 3 other lawyers that are individual attorneys, kind of all have a little bit of variety of staff members, if you will. It's hard to find somebody that is, whatever you want to call them. I can't imagine somebody in Clatsop County hiring somebody who is a individual that could go and you're going to have them read through your motion to suppress and look at that and review that and do any sort of research. Those people don't exist out here. You're not going to find that person. I don't care what you're going to pay them. We're not getting that person. We're a lot different than the larger firms, the Valley area, and that's got to be taken into consideration. I think it's more important, frankly, than that we look at, my biggest concern with my members isn't so much, do you have somebody there? And everybody has somebody there. Most of them, is it answering the phone or not answering the phone? Some of them have voicemail, and I think there's a legitimate reason for that. But a lot of folks, they have somebody in their office doing the scheduling appointments and the simple things. And they do most of the stuff themselves. In our office, there's 3 of us. Any motions we have, we've got it all on our computers. We share those. It's easier for me just to file a motion on my own. I mean, we've done it for a long time, and I go through. I do the motion. Even I won't send it up to somebody up front. I'll file the thing on email. It's just quicker for me, or on Odyssey. It's quicker for me to do that than have a secretary do that. For my group of people, it's more important that I look at that. I don't really have a big concern. Do you have a 0.25 staff member? Do you have a 0.5 staff member? I'm more concerned, frankly, are you hiring appropriate investigators? Are you hiring appropriate experts, whatever experts you need in cases? If I get attorneys that aren't doing that, that causes me a lot of concern. I think the small and big firms are a lot different. The definitions, I think we're getting a little crazy with those. I think we ought to just call them employees or staff members, and because everybody, if we started this meeting, or just everybody even wrote down today after we've even talked about this, what your definition of receptionist, administrative assistant, legal secretary, or paralegal is, we would all, so many things would be overlapping, it would be crazy. So I think we ought to just simplify it and say an employee, period. But I think that's all I got.
All right, thank you, Chris.
Chris, before you identify the next person, I have a question for you. Is an answering service a staff person?
Say that again.
Is an answering service a staff person?
We don't, I'll be blunt, we don't do an answering service. We've got a person, an employee up front at our office, and for the last, even before COVID, now that person has not been in the office for the last several months because of COVID, but even before that, we all use voicemail. And the reason for that is simple, because I don't know how many clients I've had over the years that will tell me, I talked to your secretary, she told me, and I told her A, B, and C, and I talked to the secretary, it's like, no, he never called, or no, she never told me that. When I listen to a voicemail, I get that. I know exactly what my client said or didn't say, and then I can talk to them about that. But to answer your question, is a service? Yeah, I think a service and employee. They're doing a function that an employee does. Now, whether you're paying them as a contract person or you're paying them as an employee, to me, that doesn't matter. They're doing a function.
Okay.
Gotcha. Thank you. Michelle, you have your hand raised. Is it a point of clarification, or can it wait until we got 2 more people left?
It can wait. I just have answering reception service, so I think I can speak to that point, but I'm happy to wait.
Okay. Thank you. Chris,
I'm going to call on Cott, because I think maybe at some point Cott will be able to say something on this thing, but I'm not sure.
I'm on the phone now, so hopefully
Yes.
You can hear me and it's working.
We can hear you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Chris.
I agree with Chris. Forget about labels. It's staff. That's the big label. Be as broad as possible. Include everything. It doesn't matter how an individual office labels the person. The fact is that they're, for the contract purposes, they're staff. And I would say in staff, included in staff, if they're employees or paid from contract funds, you include investigators, administrators, all that sort of stuff. But you got to be able to, and hopefully you've gathered this, treat public defender offices, consortia, law offices, and different locations all differently, because ratios don't always work everywhere, and you got to be flexible. I had an attorney who was doing justly disposition. She didn't need a staff. That's pick up the discovery the day before, review it, talk to the client at the courthouse, and and then decide whether the client's going to plead or not. If they decide they're not going to plead guilty, they get spun off to a different attorney. You got to have incredible flexibility, which is, I think, one of the problems that we're all going to be facing. Supervisors, that'd be great to have. 10-to-1 ratio seems appropriate to start with. I'm not sure about staff ratio, but certainly as an attorney does more work, they need more staff, but at some point it's financially, they just can't hire staff if they're doing, I'm doing a 30% workload because of my administrative stuff, but at 30%, I'm devoting an awful lot of the income that I get to a staff member because I can't hire somebody to work 15% of the time. It just doesn't work. You asked about vulnerabilities and risks, and I'm going to talk from a consortia viewpoint because I think they're all different depending on the law, the contractor format. If I am, and I'm a consortia administrator, how am I going to monitor somebody's staff? I can monitor maybe how much staff they have, but it doesn't have anything to do with how effective the staff person is, particularly when, unfortunately, an awful lot of, because like I think most of the consortia, we're basically all independent single offices, single attorney offices. The attorney hires a relative. Supervisors, from a consortia viewpoint, where are you going to get the money for that? We don't have money now to pay attorneys. The literature talked about essentially a supervisor wandering, if you will, wandering back and forth between being a supervisor with no caseload and then being replaced by somebody else and then going back to get a caseload. Well, that'll work in a PD's office. That does not work in a consortia at all. Because the consortia, you can't just swap attorneys in and out. So you're ending up with essentially permanent supervisors, which means, and even if you have supervisors, you're losing attorneys who are doing the work. And we can't find enough attorneys right now. It's difficult. And ultimately, with both staff and supervisors, you start to get questions of, as you pay more attention to what the individual attorneys are doing, is starting to interfere with their independent contractor status, which is a real risk. That's all I got. I don't know who else is left.
Thank you, Todd.
I know all the people on my screen have talked.
John Hamilton is the only one I have left on the list. John, are you here? I don't see anyone that looks like a JH or anything. I'm going to ask one more time. John, are you here? All right. Michelle, you had a comment you wanted to make? We do have just a few minutes if you want to follow up.
Sure. I do think that the answering service should be considered staff, as was already stated. They fill a role. And they, as people said, with the, whatever you want to call them, the employee, the staff person, if they just spent all day answering calls, that would monopolize their time pretty significantly. So having that, I consider them a part of my employee, part of my staff. Of course, I don't always, know their names, so to speak. It kind of rotates, but they fulfill an important function for my small law office, in that my staff person has more time to actually look into client questions, get back to them, calendar, do all the other things that need to be done. So I don't have to hire a second employee, and I just have the one, and I have my Ruby reception as a backup, and they've been extremely helpful. So yeah, I would definitely want that included as employee staff. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Autumn, you had mentioned at the top, maybe you wanted some additional time since you were the first one.
I think that John co-opted some of the things that I could have said about MDI, in that the ratios, I think of 2 to 1 is appropriate. So I would just be echoing some of the other things that other people said. I did send all of the descriptions for all the different jobs out to the email group that I got from Metro and from us. Metro's is obviously more delineated, I guess, with more levels. But yeah, I think that taking pieces from all of those things and plugging them in probably could be very useful. And I agree that a generalized person, rather than having 2 levels between paralegal and what you guys call legal secretary at OPDS, I don't necessarily know that there's an importance of having those be the delineations. So just, I do think that in different places they're going to morph, and in our position that we don't have anyone that provides like a paralegal type role, even in a big office.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I think Autumn, thank you. Yeah, I think we'll change that to administrative assistant. Legal secretary was sort of maybe a term of art even in some older documentation, although even a 2017 book from the ABA was referring to them as legal secretary. So, but administrative assistant is how I would view it. I see Mark Lang, you have your hand up. We have a few more minutes yet.
Yeah, I was just gonna, couple of things that that struck me is that I too use the Ruby receptionist, and that's been really helpful, especially when you get jail calls, because there's no way for them to leave a message. And so if you don't have that system in place, it basically goes nowhere if you're not able to pick up the phone. And then the other thing, I think it was Brooke that mentioned the IT part. Even for my office, and kind of talked about it too, about, it's hard to find staff that have particular skills in rural areas. I'm probably the most technological person in my office, and so I'm having to field like IT questions all the time from my staff or the other attorney, and so I do think even for smaller offices, and especially because like a lot of these things that come out from Discovery don't always download or upload very well, and so you can spend hours trying to, and it's like one file at a time, and so it's just brutal. So I think IT is a big part, at least some understanding that that's going to be a thing, and especially if people are doing all this ransomware stuff too. I mean, I think we're all pretty vulnerable to that. So
thank you, Mark.
Billy, this is Jack.
Oh, go ahead.
You see my hand up?
Jack, hold on just a second. Bruce had his hand up first.
Okay.
Bruce, go ahead, and then we'll call on you, Jack.
Sure, I just had 2 follow-up comments. With the attorney support, like Cott and the other consortium members, it's effectively as an administrator, I'm the supervisor, ad hoc supervisor for 27 attorneys. Some I supervise more than others, and I use mentors within the group to assist, or board members. But when we're struggling to find attorneys, I also carry a caseload that varies from 30 to 50% sometimes, or in years past it's been a full caseload. So effectively doing 2 jobs. So building in those supervisory roles, even within a consortium, or even if it's a regional support, would be useful. Second, with the tech support, in particular with Discovery, discovery has become so complicated in our county, and I'm sure it's similar elsewhere, in the way they provide it and in the number of formats they provide it. We really should consider creating some vendor system where a vendor could download or process all the discovery for attorneys, whether it's consortia or public defender or whatever, in an online format or a cloud-based system. I've had discussions with Russ Breton about that, and I'll continue to have those and maybe come up with a pilot model for doing that. And that could include redaction stuff, and that would save assistants a ton of time. I mean, the particular problem we're having, and I see emails about it every day, is the way our county provides discovery now. It requires you to go on and download it, and it can sometimes take hours to download a single case file of discovery. And if your system crashes or if you've got other stuff going on, it takes a while. So it would be useful for OPDS to consider having some sort of vendor to process discovery for attorneys in a uniform manner. And that could probably help control the costs that we've been paying the state or the county.
Thank you, Bruce. Jack?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. The thing about the answering service, I can see where for some organizations at some times that would be a useful tool, but I also don't see that as a substitute for an actual in-office staff. The other point, the one I'm more interested in, is the training idea. I've thought for 3 decades now that at the management conference, we should have a program for staff. And frankly, there's a lot of expense involved for the firms to send staff. So I've always been an advocate for doing it like having a real strong staff program every other year. And it's not so much the program itself, but it's the opportunity it provides the staff to go there, get to know staff in other offices where if they have a similar problem come up, they can call around. That's the best training there is. It's just word of mouth with your peers. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Jack. I see, Tracy, you have your hand up?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, great. So picking up on Chris's comment about kind of staff trainings, I know our consortium often does kind of a staff meeting and staff training for all of the assistants, for all of our members, whether it's on how we're going to report our cases to OPDS this week or how it's going to be next week. That's kind of a constant update and training. And in terms of new attorneys in our consortia, in terms of supervising our board members, we do the trainings and often kind of mentor the newer lawyers and bring them on to give them a lot of support that way. And I know most of our consortium members kind of aspire to that 1-to-1 ratio for staff. And I agree with the others that an answering service could, supplement staffing levels, but I don't think it would equate to a staff person.
All right. Thank you, Tracy. Anyone else? All right.
Billy, I can't raise my hand on the thing. I'll be really quick since I went over. Could I just briefly comment?
Go ahead, Brooke. We can hear you.
Okay. There are just 2 comments I wanted to make. One is that I agree the labels of what these staffers are don't matter, and I wasn't trying to get bogged down by labels. I just talking about different ratios of why we need certain number of staff. I think that we need to define the cost of these different labels, though, because there's a big difference between saying we need an administrator versus we need another legal assistant or whatever the role is, because it's just a different cost. And then the final thing is for the bigger offices, there's always been a county expectation that the lawyer's office will do certain things that are probably more court staff functions, like staffing arraignments and doing other things. And I think that gets more extensive the bigger the office is. So I don't know how you build that in, but I think it's something to consider for larger venues, for consortia and PDs, because I know, like, I would guess that Bruce's firm has staffing duties as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooke. So a couple of things, just at this point, I was hoping maybe we could hear a little more consensus, and it sounds like we do have some definitions coming for MDI, MPD, and then Bruce was also going to email some of those. So I'll make sure to include that in the document that we sent out for just sort of the research summary. I'll also provide, there is documentation in some of the research for HR ratios and IT ratios, so I'll provide those as well. We can also pull together there's the contract ratio, but then there's the actual ratio. A lot of entities actually have more staff than what is required. And so we can sort of show that contrast between those two. Here's the minimum requirement, but here's where most people actually are. There's no additional compensation for it, but most people are higher than the requirement, and so that might be helpful as well. And then let's see, I'm looking down through here. One of the things I want to really kind of focus a little more on next week is let's be thinking about a way that we can start to move towards drafting let's start with the definition. I think that would be best, because until we have a definition, we don't want to take a lot of time on the ratios necessarily. So what I anticipate using is Robert's Rules of Order. So we would look for someone to make a motion for a definition, someone to second it, and then we would have discussion on it. We would probably limit the discussion to 5 minutes again, just because we have a lot of people. If we need to sort of suspend that until the following meeting, that's fine. We can certainly do that as well. We'll move forward with round robin next week, but budget is sort of our next topic, the cost of things. But I think we kind of need to have a little more narrowing of what we're doing before we really look at the budget piece. So I think next week we can really, I'll open it to round robin, but if there isn't a whole lot of time that we need to spend on that, then let's move into then actual drafting of that definition. And that could be for different entities, a definition. We heard everything from, let's just say non-attorney is staff. That's the definition period, all the way through to let's keep it very flexible. Let's have some definition of what it is, but let's keep it flexible so that it could be a paralegal or legal assistant or an administrative assistant or a receptionist, but it fulfills the requirements of the contract in order for there to be a quality, some sort of assurance of quality there. And then we can think about what we do with investigators and maybe that mental health / social worker component that's in the research material. Probably more so for PD offices where they're going to have those as employees rather than consortia or law firm. This will all go into the document we'll send out here in a couple of days, sort of follow up with the summary of the minutes and whatnot. I think we're still on time with our timeline, so we don't necessarily need to review that. We're not running up against too much there. I think we're still working right along that timeline. I think we're fine there. We got 2 minutes left. Anything else for the good of the order before we end the meeting? I really appreciate all of your time and look forward to moving into this definition and really getting something in place here. Thank you.